Ebony Williams walked into the courtroom feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. The bright morning light streaming through the windows did little to brighten her mood. The courthouse was old and worn like so many buildings in the small town, and the air inside felt heavy with the tension of countless hearings that had taken place before this one. Ebony had seen the inside of many courtrooms before, but today felt different. She wasn't here for work or to support anyone this time. She was the one standing before the judge. She had been pulled over earlier that week for speeding through a construction zone. She knew she had been in a hurry, but didn't think it was anything too serious. The officer had been polite enough and had even commented that he understood the rush she was in. But the ticket was written anyway, and now here she was with no real choice but to face the consequences. She didn't expect the process to be particularly difficult, but as she sat in the back of the courtroom waiting for her case to be called, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ebony's eyes flickered to the judge sitting at the front of the room, his stern face framed by his glasses. As he flipped through paperwork, Judge Charles Hargrove had a reputation in town, known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. He was a man who valued order and discipline in the courtroom and had a reputation for ruling firmly on every case that came his way. Ebony had heard about his tough stance from colleagues and friends, but had never been directly affected by his rulings before today. When her name was called, Ebony stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She kept her posture straight and her gaze steady. As she approached the judge, she had learned long ago that when it came to being a black woman in spaces like this, maintaining composure was important. She couldn't afford to show any signs of nervousness or frustration, not as she wanted to be taken seriously. She stood before the judge and waited for him to speak. Judge Hargrove barely looked up from his papers as he addressed her, his voice deep and commanding. As he spoke, Ebony felt her heart rate increase slightly, but she kept her breathing. Even she introduced herself calmly and explained the situation. The ticket had been written in haste, she said, and she admitted she had been speeding, but she asked for some understanding. Given the circumstances, she had a son to care for, and the money from this fine would be difficult to come by, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Judge Hargrove lifted his gaze and looked her over for a moment before responding. His eyes narrowed slightly as he considered her words. He didn't offer sympathy or understanding. Instead, he spoke plainly and matter-of-factly. The fine would stand, he said, and that was the end of it. Ebony nodded silently, not trusting herself to say anything more. As the judge moved on to the next case, she turned and walked back to her seat, feeling a strange mix of frustration and resignation fill her chest. She hadn't expected anything different, but it still stung more than she wanted to admit. As Ebony walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the fine settled heavier on her chest with every step she took. It wasn't just the money. It was the feeling of being dismissed, the feeling that she had been judged not for who she was, but for the assumptions others made about her. The fine seemed small in comparison to the other challenges she faced daily, but it was the principle that stung the most. She had been calm, polite, and respectful, yet it hadn't mattered to Judge Hargrove. He hadn't seen her as more than a woman breaking the law. Ebony wasn't a stranger to such moments. She had been underestimated and overlooked countless times in her life. But this one felt different. It felt personal. She had given so much to this town and to the people in it, but here she was sitting in front of a judge who didn't even bother to look past the surface of her case. When his ruling came down harsh and fast, Ebony felt it like a blow to her self-worth. She shook her head as she made her way to the parking lot, trying to push the frustration aside, but it lingered gnawing at her. She got into her car and started the engine, the familiar hum of the vehicle doing little to calm her racing thoughts. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, but she didn't bother looking at it. She had a busy day ahead and didn't want to waste any more time dwelling on this small setback. She needed to focus on her son, her work, and the next task on her long list. By the time she arrived at the police station, she had mostly pushed the court incident from her mind, but the weight of it still hung around her like a shadow. As she walked into the building, her colleagues greeted her warmly with smiles and nods, but none of them knew the tension she carried inside. She wasn't one to show weakness, especially at work, so she put on the mask of professionalism and got straight to her duties. Ebony had always been determined to rise above the circumstances life had handed her. She had fought for every inch of respect and recognition she had earned, but it never felt like enough. There were always those who saw her as nothing more than a woman of color, a mother, a figure to be ignored or dismissed. But she wasn't just any of those things. She was a decorated officer, someone who had earned the respect of her peers and the community for her dedication and hard work. Her day was filled with routine calls to investigate noise complaints and minor accidents, but there was always a lingering thought in the back of her mind about Judge Hargrove and the fine he had imposed on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was a reminder that no matter how much she achieved or how much she gave, she would always be seen through a different lens than her white colleagues. During a quiet moment, her colleague Derek approached her. He was a fellow officer and a close friend who had seen Ebony navigate the complexities of her job and the community's perceptions of her. Derek had noticed her mood that day, and he could tell something was off. "You all right, Ebony?" he asked gently. Ebony let out a slow breath before responding, "Yeah, just a little frustrated with how things went today." Derek raised an eyebrow of the court case. "I saw the fine they slapped on you." "Yeah," Ebony said, looking down at the floor. "I don't know why it got to me, but it did." She hesitated for a moment before continuing, "It's just hard sometimes, feeling like you're never seen for who you really are." Derek nodded understandingly. "I hear you on that. We all have our struggles, but you're making a difference, Ebony, more than most people realize." She smiled faintly, but the doubt still lingered in her heart as they moved on with their shift. Ebony couldn't shake the feeling that Judge Hargrove's decision was just one example of how deeply ingrained the biases in her town were, but she was determined not to let it define her. She had a purpose, and she would keep moving forward even if no one else understood it. Ebony's life had always been a balancing act. She moved through the world with purpose, knowing the sacrifices she had made to get to where she was and the weight of responsibility she carried every day. By day, she served as a dedicated officer, putting her life on the line for the safety of others. And by night, she focused on raising her son and supporting her community. But despite all the work she did, the recognition she truly craved seemed to always be just out of reach. As a woman of color in a predominantly white town, Ebony had long learned to navigate the undercurrent of subtle prejudices that lingered in the air. It wasn't always overt, but it was there in the way people treated her, in the way they underestimated her abilities and judged her based on her appearance rather than her actions. Judge Hargrove's fine had only brought that reality to the surface, reminding her once again that no matter how much she achieved, no matter how many awards she earned, there would always be people who saw her as less than. The morning after her court appearance, Ebony woke up early to get her son, Marcus, ready for school. She loved these quiet moments before the day fully began, the moments when she could gather her thoughts and center herself. As Marcus ate his breakfast, she watched him with pride. At only 9 years old, he was already starting to show signs of the kindness, strength, and determination that she hoped he would grow up to embody. She smiled to herself, thinking about the future she was working so hard to build for him. Yet even as she thought about her son, a lingering bitterness clung to her thoughts. It wasn't just the fine, though that was certainly a part of it. It was the way people in the community, especially the ones in positions of power, viewed her. Ebony's reputation as an officer was solid. She had earned respect from her colleagues, the local businesses, and even from some members of the town's most skeptical families. But out there, in the broader world beyond her uniform, she was still seen through a lens of prejudice. That morning, as she drove to work, Ebony's thoughts once again turned to Judge Hargrove. She hadn't heard anything about him beyond the courtroom, but there was something about him that didn't sit right with her. He had made an assumption about her character, her worth, based solely on the superficial facts of the case. And yet here she was, someone who had faced down danger countless times, someone who had given so much of herself to this community, being treated like just another face in the crowd. At the station, she was greeted by her colleagues, all of whom were unaware of the personal conflict swirling within her. The calls came in, one after the other, routine duties that kept her busy enough to temporarily push aside her frustrations. She responded to a few minor accidents, assisted with a community event, and even helped with some outreach work. But all the while, her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. It was almost as if she couldn't escape the feeling that Judge Hargrove's fine was a reflection of something deeper. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the break room with Durek, she couldn't help but bring it up again. "I just don't get it," she said, staring into her coffee cup. "How is it that I'm out there, doing my job day in and day out, saving lives, making a difference, and yet all it takes is one mistake, one slip up, and suddenly I'm just another person who broke the law?" Derek, who had been quiet as he listened to her, nodded thoughtfully. "It's frustrating, I know, but you've got to remember that your worth isn't defined by a fine or a single moment in a courtroom. You've done so much good for this town. It's just sometimes people, especially the ones in power, don't always see it." Ebony looked at him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and weariness. "I know, but it still hurts." The conversation lingered in her mind as she went through the rest of the day. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this situation, something about the way she was being treated that went beyond just the fine. It wasn't the law or the ticket that bothered her. It was the way it made her feel invisible, as if the good she had done didn't matter in the eyes of those who mattered most. Judge Charles Hargrove sat in his office late that evening, his thoughts consumed by the woman he had fined earlier that day. Ebony Williams, a name he couldn't shake from his mind. At first, he had simply viewed her as another driver who had broken the law, someone who didn't deserve any special treatment. But now, after learning a little more about her, he began to question his decision. It wasn't just the fine, it was everything he had learned about her after the fact. As the evening dragged on, Hargrove found himself browsing the local news websites, seeking more information about Ebony. There were articles about her work with the community, her efforts to mentor young people, and her dedication to the local police force. The more he read, the more he realized that Ebony Williams wasn't just a woman who had broken the law. She was a woman who had sacrificed and worked tirelessly to make her community a better place. He read about her awards, her commendations for bravery in the field, the lives she had saved, and the people she had helped. She wasn't just an officer, she was a hero. The more Hargrove learned, the more guilt began to weigh on him. He had met her only briefly in the courtroom, and he had only seen a woman who had made a mistake. He hadn't seen the full picture. He hadn't seen the depth of her character, the struggles she had overcome, and the incredible work she had done to serve others. His gut told him that his ruling had been too harsh, that he hadn't taken enough time to truly understand the person standing before him. The realization gnawed at him, leaving him unsettled and restless. What kind of judge was he, if he couldn't even see beyond the surface? He had prided himself on being impartial and fair, but now he saw how quickly he had allowed his own biases to cloud his judgment. He had made assumptions based on what he saw, not based on who she truly was. Ebony Williams wasn't just another ticketed driver. She was someone who had fought against the odds her entire life, someone who had earned every bit of respect she had, and he had dismissed her as nothing more than an inconvenience in his courtroom. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about Ebony's calm demeanor as she stood before him, about the way she had handled the situation with grace. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't argued, and she certainly hadn't let the situation break her. She had been respectful and composed, and yet he had failed to show her the same level of respect in return. He knew that he had to make it right. The question was how. How could he undo the harm he had done with just a few words? A fine was a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but for Ebony, it was a reminder of how the system often failed people like her. How many others had been treated like she had? How many others had been judged based on their appearance, their background, or their circumstances, rather than who they truly were? He could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him, and he knew that he couldn't just let it go. He had to do something to make it right. He couldn't change the past, but perhaps there was a way to change the future. Perhaps he could meet with Ebony, apologize for his misjudgment, and find a way to support her as she continued to do the important work she had always done. It wasn't enough to simply regret his decision. He needed to take action. The next morning, Hargrove made a decision. He would reach out to Ebony Williams. He wasn't sure what the conversation would look like, or whether she would even be willing to meet with him. But one thing was certain, he couldn't move forward until he made things right. The next few days passed in a blur for Ebony. Between her work at the station, her commitments to the community, and her responsibilities as a mother, she barely had time to reflect on the encounter with Judge Hargrove. Still, the sting of his fine lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had managed to bury the frustration beneath her usual calm, but it kept creeping up at odd moments, particularly when she was at home, trying to unwind after a long day. It was a Friday morning when she received an unexpected call. She was sipping her coffee, preparing to head into work, when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The name on the screen surprised her: Judge Charles Hargrove. She hadn't anticipated hearing from him, not after the way their brief encounter had ended. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer, but then curiosity got the better of her, and she swiped the screen. "Good morning, this is Ebony Williams," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unexpectedness of the situation. "Ms. Williams," Hargrove's voice came through, low and measured. "This is Judge Hargrove. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Ebony's heart skipped a beat. She was taken aback but kept her voice polite. "No, not at all. How can I help you, Judge?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Ebony could almost hear Hargrove gathering his thoughts. "I wanted to reach out personally to apologize," he began, his tone sincere. "I've had some time to think about your case and, frankly, about the way I handled it. I made a mistake, Ms. Williams. I didn't take the time to fully understand who you are before making my decision, and I want to correct that." Ebony felt a mix of emotions wash over her. She hadn't expected this. She had expected him to dismiss the situation or offer some hollow excuse, but not an apology, not this level of self-awareness. She sat down at the kitchen table, the phone pressed to her ear as she tried to process what he was saying. "I appreciate you saying that," Ebony finally replied, her voice steady but laced with caution. "But why now? Why the sudden change of heart?" "I've had time to reflect," Hargrove said, and she could hear the regret in his voice. "I've read about your work in this community, the lives you've touched, the way you've served with dedication and commitment. I realized that I made assumptions about you that were unfair. You're more than just the woman who got the speeding ticket. You're an officer, a hero, and someone who deserves better than I gave you in that courtroom." Ebony felt a lump form in her throat, her eyes stinging as the weight of his words hit her. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not one that felt so genuine. "I appreciate your words, Judge. But the fine, it wasn't just about the money. It was about how easily you dismissed me. I've been fighting against that my whole life. To be judged without being seen for who I truly am. I've had to prove myself over and over again, not just as a woman, but as a black woman trying to make a difference." There was a silence on the other end, and for a moment, Ebony wasn't sure if he would say anything else. Finally, he spoke again. "I can't undo the past, but I can do something moving forward. If you'd be willing to meet, I'd like to talk more, and I'd like to find a way to make things right." Ebony took a deep breath. She had spent so much of her life guarding herself from disappointment, from people who would apologize but never change their actions. But something in Hargrove's voice made her consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. "All right," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Let's meet. I'll make time." They arranged to meet at a small cafe later that afternoon, a neutral spot where they could talk face to face. As Ebony hung up the phone, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope, mixed with a healthy dose of skepticism. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting, but at least it was a start. Ebony arrived at the small cafe just a few minutes early, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent the entire afternoon wondering if meeting Judge Hargrove was a mistake. She had made a decision, of course, but now that she was here, seated in the corner booth with her coffee untouched in front of her, doubts began to creep in. What if he wasn't sincere? What if this was just a ploy to appease his conscience without any real commitment to change? She glanced around the cafe, watching people come and go, but none of them seemed to notice the weight of the moment. Here she was, A woman who had spent so many years earning respect and fighting against the limitations placed on her by society, sitting across from a man who had, only days before, dismissed her as just another ticketed driver. Could his apology really be enough to undo the harm he caused? The door chimed, and Ebony looked up to see Judge Hargrove entering. He wore a dark suit, looking every bit the man who commanded authority in a courtroom. But there was something different in his demeanor today. He looked less rigid, his posture less defensive, almost as though he, too, was carrying the weight of something important. "Ms. Williams," he said with a slight nod as he approached the table, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Ebony stood, offering a polite smile, though there was still a trace of caution in her eyes. "Of course, Judge. Thank you for reaching out." They both sat down, the initial tension between them palpable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The clinking of cups and the soft hum of conversations from nearby tables filled the silence. Ebony studied Hargrove, trying to read his face to determine if this moment was genuine or just another performance. He seemed to be doing the same, his eyes searching hers for signs of forgiveness, for some indication that he had not lost her trust entirely. Finally, it was Hargrove who broke the silence. "I want to start by saying that I'm truly sorry, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Not just for the fine, but for the way I judged you that day. I failed to see you for who you truly are, and I failed to honor the person you've become. You've done more for this town, for the people in it, than I've given you credit for." Ebony took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the warm cup of coffee before her. She had expected an apology, but not one like this, not one that acknowledged her pain and the weight of the systems she had spent so much time fighting against. "I've heard people say things like that before," she said slowly, her voice soft but firm. "But actions always speak louder than words." Hargrove nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand. That's why I want to do more than just apologize. I want to find a way to show you that I truly respect you and the work you've done. If you're willing to give me a chance, I'd like to help amplify your voice, whether that's through supporting your community work or helping to create a stronger partnership between the justice system and local organizations like yours. I know it's not enough, but it's a start." Ebony sat back in her seat, considering his words. She had spent so much time in the trenches, fighting against the system that often left her feeling small and unheard. She wasn't sure if this meeting was a turning point or if it was just another chapter in a long story of disappointments. But Hargrove's sincerity, his willingness to acknowledge his own mistakes and try to make a difference, made her pause. "You're right," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. "It's a start. But it's not about what you can do for me, Judge. It's about what we can do together for the people who need change the most." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. There was a shift in the atmosphere as both of them recognized the significance of the moment. Hargrove nodded once more, understanding that this wasn't about one apology, one fine, or one decision in a courtroom. It was about creating real, lasting change, change that came from understanding, from growth, and from true partnership. "I'm willing to do that, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I just hope you'll let me prove it." In the weeks that followed their meeting, things began to change, but not as quickly as Ebony had hoped. Despite Hargrove's promises, there was a subtle, almost invisible resistance from the community and the justice system that both of them had to navigate. Change was never easy, especially when it involved systems that had been built to preserve the status quo. Ebony felt a glimmer of hope, but it was often tempered with frustration. She had agreed to work with Judge Hargrove to improve the relationship between law enforcement and the community, but the reality of making that change was more challenging than she had anticipated. For one thing, many of her colleagues at the police station were skeptical of the judge's intentions. While they appreciated the apology, they wondered if it was just a temporary effort to appease his conscience or if it was truly a sign of a deeper commitment to reform. Ebony knew that her position was just as delicate. She wasn't sure what Hargrove was capable of or whether his change of heart would truly lead to something tangible. But she also understood that she couldn't let her guard down completely. If there was any chance for the system to evolve, She would have to be the one to lead the charge. She couldn't just accept his words. She needed to see actions, real, visible actions that proved he was serious. One afternoon, as she was heading home after a long day of community outreach, Ebony received a call from Hargrove. He was calling to discuss their next steps, but the conversation was different this time. There was a new sense of urgency in his voice. I've been thinking about what you said that day in the cafe, Hargrove began after a brief exchange of pleasantries. It's not just about me making changes or offering support for your programs. It's about fundamentally changing how the justice system interacts with the communities it serves. And that starts with me really listening to the people I'm supposed to serve. Ebony sat up straighter, her curiosity piqued. What exactly are you suggesting, Judge? I'm going to propose a new initiative, he said, his voice gaining strength. A series of town halls where community members can openly discuss their concerns with the justice system, law enforcement, and the courts. These won't be just listening sessions. There'll be opportunities for us to address systemic issues, to see where we can work together to make real changes. I want to invite you to lead the discussion in our first one. Ebony's mind raced as she processed his words. The idea was bold, ambitious even, and it could be the turning point both she and Hargrove needed. She had spent years talking about reform, advocating for change, but it had always felt like she was shouting into a void. A town hall was a chance to bring the community together, to bring real concerns into the light, and maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something more. I'm honored that you want me to lead it, she said after a brief pause, her voice tinged with both excitement and caution. But you know as well as I do that this won't be easy. People are going to be skeptical, especially after everything that's happened. If we want this to work, we need to show them that we're not just talking, we're acting. I know, Hargrove agreed, his tone resolute. That's why I'm willing to start with the hard conversations. No more hiding behind paperwork or closed doors. It's time for the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. We're going to do this together, Ebony. She felt a wave of emotion as she listened to him, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just the system they were fighting against. It was years of mistrust, of feeling overlooked, of people who had been silenced for too long. This town hall could be the first real step toward healing, but it would require more than just talking. It would require vulnerability, honesty, and a commitment from both sides to finally confront the issues head on. I'm in, Ebony said, her voice firm with determination. Let's do it. Let's show them we can make change happen. As she hung up the phone, Ebony felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. This wasn't going to be easy, but she had never backed down from a challenge before. And now, with Hargrove by her side, maybe, just maybe, things could finally start to shift. The town hall was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the tension in the community was palpable. Word had spread quickly that Judge Hargrove and Ebony Williams were working together on an initiative aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement, the justice system, and the people they were supposed to serve. Some were excited, hopeful that this could be the beginning of real change. Others were skeptical, questioning if it was just another empty gesture. On the day of the event, the local community center was packed. Residents, activists, officers, and even a few local government officials filled the room, the air thick with anticipation. Ebony arrived early, standing at the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Her eyes scanned the crowd, noting the mix of eager faces and hesitant expressions. She understood the skepticism. She had felt it too, many times in her life. It was hard to trust the system when it had so often let you down. Judge Hargrove arrived shortly after, and though he appeared composed as always, there was a look in his eyes that revealed his nerves. Ebony had seen it in him before, that flicker of doubt. This was uncharted territory for both of them. They were asking people to do something that wasn't easy, to open up, to trust, and to believe that this time, things could be different. As the event began, Ebony stepped up to the front of the room. The hum of conversation died down, and all eyes turned toward her. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, but also the power that came with it. This was her chance, not just for herself, but for every person in that room who had been let down by the system. Thank you all for being here today. Ebony began, her voice clear and steady. We're here because we know that things need to change. We can't ignore the divisions, the misunderstandings, the frustrations that have been simmering for years. But we also know that change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. What we're asking today is for a commitment to listen, really listen, and to engage with each other, not as adversaries, but as human beings who want the same thing: a safe, just, and equal community for everyone. Her words hung in the air, and the room was quiet as the people in attendance absorbed them. After a long pause, she gestured to Judge Hargrove, who stood beside her. I know many of you are here because of the fine I imposed on Ms. Williams a few weeks ago, Judge Hargrove said, his voice calm but firm. I came to realize, after much reflection, that I failed to see her for who she truly is, someone who has worked tirelessly to make this community better. And that's why I'm here today, to listen and to learn how we can all do better together. I'm not here to offer solutions, but to start a conversation that I hope will lead to real change. There was a shift in the room. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by curiosity and cautious optimism. For the first time in what felt like years, people felt like their voices might finally be heard. The town hall wasn't a miracle cure, but it was the beginning of something larger, something they had been waiting for. The discussion that followed was raw and emotional. People shared their experiences with the justice system, with law enforcement, with the community at large. They spoke about the fear they felt when encountering police officers, the unfair treatment they had experienced, and the lack of trust in the courts. But they also spoke about their hopes, about wanting to work together, about finding common ground, and about building a system that worked for everyone. Ebony and Hargrove listened attentively, asking questions when needed, offering their perspectives, but never interrupting. The conversation was long, sometimes uncomfortable, but always respectful. At the end of the evening, no one had all the answers, but everyone left feeling like something important had shifted. As Ebony stood at the exit, shaking hands and thanking people for attending, she caught Hargrove's eye. He gave her a small but genuine smile. It wasn't perfect, but they had done something. They had started a conversation, and in doing so, they had created the possibility of change. As she walked out into the cool night air, Ebony felt a sense of cautious optimism. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the right kind of work, the kind that would lead them to a future where justice was truly blind, where every voice was heard, and where the law served everyone equally, without prejudice or bias.